Think your grandma's potato recipes were unbeatable? Well, it's time to turn the tables because these dishes are so good they've set the bar higher than grandma could ever reach. They were once forgotten, but trust me, you'll regret it if you let them slip away again. Stewed potatoes are a pretty common one. We all know them, and we've probably all had them. Before I really get into the goodness of stewed potatoes, though, let me tell you why I think America and potatoes are besties and have been for a pretty long while. See, you're no stranger to the harsh history of the United States of America and how it's really put citizens through the ringer more times than I can count. The recession, the wars, the economic slumps and ruts, inflation. A lot of situations that make it hard to put a fresh, hot meal that tastes good on the table every day. It was in times like these that potatoes became really important because they were easy to grow, readily available, and could be made in just about every sort of way you can imagine. In times like those, it was pretty common to stew potatoes and make a simple but effective dish that only needed to be seasoned with a bit of salt, pepper, and maybe a bit of butter if you like that extra vibrant flavor. The potatoes would get soft, almost like a mushy, earthy cream, and the slow cooking really amplified their tenderness. Mix some onions, and you have yourself a dish good for the whole family, and for what? Literally no effort. That's just a good deal, and to be honest, after a hard day spent dozing off on company time, I'd love to come home to something that's easy to cook. It's just sad that simple go-tos like this end up vanishing when things get better for the country and people get access to better, more complex, and extravagant food. Old-fashioned potato cakes are a forgotten recipe that really filled up a lot of people's stomachs on days where nothing else was available. Even on days where you did have a lot of food in the pantry and enough money in the wallet to go out for something else, if you didn't feel whatever was there at home, these potato cakes were an easy-to-make recipe that were sort of the zenith of comfort food. It was all about that crispy exterior, something you only got after a lot of trial and error with the right amount of oil and the time. Most recommend you fry them for a good 15 to 20 minutes, but I think everyone should experiment and find whatever works for them best, because any variation means a different texture. What you get are these wonderful cakes made out of mashed potatoes shaped into cakes. It's a pretty fun way to have potatoes if you're tired of the usual mashed potato and fries routine we go through every week. They're old-fashioned for a reason, though. Eventually, Americans would just start exploring more baking techniques from other cultures, and of course, that meant taking a good crack at their actual cakes, and the fancy ones too at that. Cheesy scalloped potatoes with ham were a great one. This was one of those potato dishes that was really the main star, the tourist attraction, the cream of the crop. It highlighted the potato and really worked around it as an ingredient, but it was because the potato was there that the accessories in the dish, like the scallop, ham, and cheese, were all so much better. That's how you know you're sitting on gold, because when your ingredients and preparation synergize that well, you're cooking up something amazing. Cheesy, scalloped potatoes with ham were a pretty common option for Thanksgiving because they had that homely feeling and they made use of the most simple, everyday ingredients like Gruyere or cheddar cheese and cheap ham, garlic, and onion. I mean, who doesn't have that laying around? Maybe you might need to go shopping for the cheese, but that's really about it. This is a simple and versatile dish that also puts in a little bit of seafood for people who like their potatoes with some fresh catches of the day, and you can always up the seasoning. It's not really a main course, but it outclasses most of your typical appetizers. Potatoes as a whole would go more towards being side pieces in dishes, though, thanks to fast food culture, so stuff like this didn't stick around for too long. Remember how I said that Americans kind of wanted to start exploring new dishes from other cultures? One of those was seeing what Jewish people got up to in the kitchen, and a few sneak peeks revealed potato kugels and how amazing they could really be. This dish has Ashkenazi roots, and it's often served during Sabbath or other Jewish traditions and important events and days. It's pretty crispy, just like potato cakes, but in a bit of a more subtle way. With those, it's like the crunch is the main element, but here, it's just another nice texture amongst many other notable ones. It's soft on the inside, for example, so you get a pretty satisfying sensation with each bite. You use grated or pureed potatoes and mix them with eggs, salt, pepper, and onions, and you end up getting a pretty nicely balanced dish. Some sweetness from the onion, the earthiness of the potato, the slight kick from the salt and pepper, and a thick consistency thanks to the eggs. Jewish immigrants brought this one over, and I'm pretty glad they did. I just wish it could stick around long enough to be a menu item today too, but unfortunately, this went back to being a thing you'd only know about if you grew up in traditional old-school Jewish families. So, another note Americans took out of another country's cookbook was France's dauphinois potatoes, which were also known as gratin dauphinois because the dish originated from the Dauphin region in southeastern France. If you want to be pretty uptight about it, you best follow tradition, and you know how the French get about deviating from the recipe. It's made with raw potatoes and heavy cream, then layered and baked in a pretty slow place. The trick here is the use of the heavy cream, which almost gives it a pretty nutty taste that works really well with the layers of potato laced with notes of garlic and onions. You also really need to make sure you use either Gruyere or cheddar cheese, because otherwise you just won't get that nutty flavor that makes this dish work so well. It's an 18th century classic, so I can't say it hasn't had its time to shine, but come on, doesn't it sound cool? For the French, they'd always have it with steaks, roasts, and any kind of protein-based main course, and Americans have honestly treated it much the same way. But the dish gives off an air of luxury and works well as a side, elevating any dish that it's paired with. If it were still around, I'd definitely try ordering. What about you? You can't have a recipe list about potato dishes that'll leave your grandma's cooking in the dust and not get into a little casserole-based magic, can you? Although a lot of people might take that personally because, if we're being real, it's pretty damn hard to outclass any grandma's casserole. It's what Bruce Lee said about practicing one kick 10,000 times rather than 10,000 kicks once. That's a dish grandmas have spent their entire cooking careers perfecting, serving endless casseroles as family dinners and party meals. So when the idea of a hamburger potato casserole rolled around, suffice it to say people didn't exactly take to it too well. The ground beef, potatoes, onions, and the cheesy tangy sauce combo was a bit strong flavor-wise to immediately take off, but when the Second World War meant that people had to ration and keep things really budget-friendly, a lot more people started to warm up to the idea of a casserole made entirely of potatoes and a little bit of beef, especially because proteins like that had gotten rare back in the day, unless you were rich. But if you were, you wouldn't be eating potatoes for breakfast, lunch, and dinner back then either, would you? Fondant potatoes were a recipe from the middle of the 20th century that took well. A little too well, if you ask me. They were these rick rounds of potatoes that were first browned in butter until they were golden and then slow cooked in chicken or beef stock. As a result, you get potatoes with the perfect crisp exterior and an extremely flavorful and tender interior. This kind of dish was sometimes seen as rich people's food, even though it's really not that deep. It's just potatoes that have been mixed with some butter. Plus, it doesn't help that the dish only started appearing in high-end American restaurants later on, towards the end of the 20th century, and gained a reputation for being a potato dish that was a bit more fancy and on the gourmet side. Nowadays, though, you could just whip this up in your own home. That goes for a lot of these dishes, actually. They've become exponentially easier to make, and the ingredients are also a lot easier to get. So if you were looking for any ideas for a new TikTok, then there's a lot of inspiration you could get from here. This next one is even more on the fancier side than fondant potatoes, and I'm pretty sure it deserves to be here too. This one is known as Syracuse salt potatoes. And fun fact, though you might have already guessed, these came from Syracuse, New York. It has its roots in the 19th century when it was made using local potatoes that would then be boiled in salt brine from the local springs, but today, you don't need to do any of that. Over time, the dish has become a lot more accessible, which honestly works out great for potato heads like me because it means we get to eat this so much more often. The star of the show this time really is that Syracuse salt, which gives the natural flavor of a potato one serious boost. But the fact that they've been boiled gives them a perfectly creamy interior that's just to die for as soon as you get your first taste in. It's a no-fuss recipe that doesn't demand much of you except maybe a trip to the store for the right salt and potatoes, but even that can be ordered online now. This actually kind of started getting popular in the Depression, but fully settled in as a resident of American culture when we started to ask our immigrant communities and foreign neighbors what they do with their potatoes. The answer was a lot more simple than you'd expect, but it's also not something you would see coming if your idea of potatoes hasn't expanded past it being a side to meaty main courses. Potato dumplings are made by mashed or grated potatoes with flour, eggs, and sometimes even breadcrumbs, and the end result is these really flavorful dumplings that are perfect for munching. That first bite has all that chewy goodness you associate with a dumpling, but you'll notice it eventually melts into a much softer sensation that fits exactly what you think a potato dumpling would taste and feel like. It was pretty common in the Midwest, and it was often served alongside stews or served on platters as a party dish. Nothing like a bit of grandma against grandma action to get into high gear as we get halfway through the list. This time we have Great Grandma John's pasties, though there wasn't actually any Grandma John. What there was, however, was a massive influx of migrants from Europe in areas like Michigan's peninsulas. They would come from Cornwall, and they were usually here to try their hand at mining. One of the childhood favorites of theirs used to be this pastry with a filling of diced potatoes, a flaky and golden crust, and incredibly balanced flavor profiles that make it the perfect dish to have at a party or a celebration. If you feel hungry and like you can't manage without some quick and easy comfort food, then they're great for that too. It's mostly just how easy these pasties are to make and how good they work if you start baking in a batch. Plus, they're one of the few recipes out there to use stuff like rutabaga and ground or cubed meat, which really adds to the savory aspect of the dish. All in all, this is a solid one from our British friends, and it might just show you a whole new side to potatoes you hadn't imagined before. Meat and tater hot dishes. Where do we even begin with this one? It's up there in the casserole history books, and that's just an objective fact you can't argue with. When you get as much traction as this recipe has at potlucks, family gatherings, church events, and community dinners, then you just solidify yourself as a solid contender for America's Culinary Hall of Fame, and these have definitely earned their spot. If you went to Minnesota, this was basically all you could find in the early 20th century if you go back to before the recession devastated everything. A hot dish might make you think of some kind of meat and tater tot combo, but it was actually just a local term for a casserole that could be made in one pan. The mushroom cream soup is here to die for, and the beef just elevated every flavor the potatoes brought and wrapped the whole thing up in a wonderful little bow. You top that off with some shredded cheese and crispy onions, and you have yourself a casserole experience you'd never see coming from a mile away if you just stuck to the traditionals and the tried and tested. It's good to put yourself out there, not just for friends or romance, but also for food. You may be surprised about all the tastes you haven't discovered yet that have been sitting under your nose this whole time. Then again, that's what I'm here for, right? Polish pierogies are what they sound like. It was a dish that got here to America through the Polish immigrants that started settling in places like Pittsburgh and Chicago, and they formed the very first Polish-American communities in America's history. It's a little different from the stuff we're used to seeing on the list so far, and it's definitely not a casserole, nor does it have the same heavyweight group meal power that you'd associate with a dish like that, but what it lacks in filling capabilities it makes up for in a lot of extremely well-rounded flavors. Pierogies are filled with mashed potatoes that have been mixed with cheese, but a lot of different fillings like sauerkraut, mushroom, and potato mixes, and ground meat are also used, and then they're boiled or pan-fried. As a result, they end up having this chewy sensation with a soft but addictive filling inside. It has a bit of a tang to it, but it takes care of most flavors you'd want from a savory dish, and the caramelized onions were just made for this dish. It's a hallmark of Polish-American cooking, and I can definitely see why. Potato candy is a pretty unique treat, and it's definitely the first time you've heard of a potato-based dessert on this list so far. This dish got really popular in places like the southern areas of America and Appalachia. It's not surprising that you can't find this dish anymore, since this is one straight out of the Great Depression, and you want to know why? It's because people had developed a culture of no-bake dishes that didn't require traditional baking ingredients because they were becoming so awfully hard to come by, and it just wasn't realistic to use that much money for flour, eggs, and batter when you could get bread, potatoes, and vegetables instead. It was all about practicality. But this dish shows one thing a lot of people don't talk about enough when it comes to the recession that changed everything for the 20th century. People still love to eat. I know that sounds redundant, but in times of massive scarcity, it's easy to fall into a mindset of, well, if I don't need it, it's a waste. But it was all really sudden, and people still loved to eat sweet things to feel good. They loved comfort food. They wanted their favorite casserole or meatloaf. It was that need that gave birth to things like potato candies. Some powdered sugar and mashed potatoes together made a sweet dough that would be spread with peanut butter, rolled into a log and sliced, and honestly, you couldn't even tell this was a potato dish. Daisy's potato dressing is a name that just gets you in the mood for a nice day in a cottage or relaxing at home. I wouldn't blame you, since the dish puts you in exactly that kind of mood too. It's one of those dishes you enjoy when the summer breeze hits just right. The cat's being awfully nice. The plants look even greener. One of those days where it feels like God's giving everyone some much-needed rest and relaxation. Daisy's potato dressing is a lesser-known twist on bread-based dressings, and it got its reputation being passed around family dinners all over the South and Midwest. Potatoes usually replace bread to make the filling, and these dishes include mashed and grated potatoes with sautéed onions and celery, plus more staple herbs you'd find in your pantry like sage and thyme. Since it's America, you can never do without some kind of meat, so people would often even add diced sausages or crumbled bacon to the mix for a bit of a flavorful push. You get an incredibly nice dressing that feels light on the stomach, doesn't bloat you, and is great for Thanksgiving appetizers. This dish actually came into existence because of rural communities that made a lot of use of potatoes because of how plentiful they are. See? I told you we've been best buddies for hundreds of years. I just wish I could go to a time where this was available in stores or where all the neighbors were making it, because now it's just not something you see anymore unless you go out of your way to explore food history here, like you are now. Speaking of history, let's talk a bit more about the contemporary, shall we? Muffin pan potato sticks are inspired by classic dishes like roasted potatoes and cheese sticks, but instead with a muffin pan and potato twist that will leave you aching for more and more. You need to slice these potatoes super thin, so brush up your knife skills if you aren't feeling too confident. Once that's done, all you need is to stack them in muffin tins, season them with your choice of herbs, butter, and grated Parmesan cheese, and then you just bake them until they're that golden color that lets you know you have a food coma waiting in your oven. They're also really good to look at. The mix of oranges and yellows makes for one appetizing dish with a lovely scent, and it's a reinvention of comfort food that fell out of the mainstream a long time ago. It was only around the late 20th century that this dish came into public awareness, so while it may not be as popular as it first started, there are still enough places and cookbooks that can show you how to make a good lunch out of this. Next, we have a French mountain dish from the Savoy area, which is traditionally made with bacon, potatoes, and a special cheese known as reblochon. This is what we call a tartiflette, and in America, it's just referred to as a potato and cheese bake. Pardon my French. The dish became extremely popular in the 1990s and 2000s, as Americans were heavily adopting European cuisines and recipes into their own, and then the result became this really nice, delicious cheese potato dish that had like a very smoky and savory flavor. The bacon itself was unlike what you were ever used to, because nobody thought bacon could be that soft and tender. There were some places that had a strong focus on European cooking, like Colorado and Vermont, and it did really well there. You'd probably even find restaurants making this. It also fit in with the whole mountain vibe they have going on since they're close by to our natural ranges, and it was really common for climbers and hikers to have this at ski lodges. Nowadays, in the age of social media, it's so hard for anything to stay trendy because every reel is its own do-it-yourself. Convenience food-based recipe. So things like these become more of a local fact that people know about, but not something you might see trending on Instagram. Brie and potato frittata bites are the perfect thing for a salad bar, an appetizer, or a light, low-calorie snack that you can enjoy without any kind of worries. Brie cheese is pretty healthy on its own, but there's a lot that can be done to amplify its taste, and luckily, that's exactly what happens when you mix it in with some potatoes. You cut the potatoes into a frittata form and lightly cook the potatoes with some eggs, herbs, and cheese, then taking some muffin tins, you bake them. What you end up getting is a perfectly seasoned, very warm and comforting dish that follows the classic American philosophy of taking the simplest things in life, mixing them together, and creating something that's way more than either of those things could individually be. I mean, sure, we all love a good brie sandwich and we all love a good potato-based snack, but when you mix them together, it's just unreal. Plus, you throw some chives and dip fries in that bad boy, you're not getting up for the next hour. Dutch's potatoes are kind of as fancy as they sound, but also not really. See, you think I mean a 5-star dish at a critically acclaimed restaurant. But I really just mean special occasions like birthdays and anniversaries. Well, they used to make them for those kinds of days before. Nowadays, you just order takeout, but anyway, this is about better times. You take some mashed potatoes, butter, crema, and egg yolks, and you end up getting a really custard-like texture. Then you just need to fill a pipe with that mix and pipe it into rosettes and other nice fancy shapes. Hey, some go for dinosaurs, others go for roses. Bring out the sculptor in you and find out what you like. If you prefer to be more straight to business and not waste time decorating your food, something I can really respect, by the way, then you can always just go for basic shapes. All you gotta do then is bake them, and voila, you get an incredibly fancy-looking and tasting dish that might not come out of a palace, but will still have you feeling like royalty. JoJo potatoes are a rustic, hearty dish that came right out of the Midwest in the 1960s and 70s and made a firm statement about how it was here to stay. I mean, it was beating all other snacks, and most fast food places were putting this on their menus, whipping up new deals and discounts and advertising their best take on JoJo potatoes. And I get why. Thick potato wedges with actual seasoning? I'm talking about garlic, paprika, salt, pepper, thyme, and herbs. A crispy first bite and a fluffy and filling interior? They're literally the perfect thing to have with a pizza, and they're one of the best ways I've ever seen to make potato wedges. It's classic American comfort food. No fuss, no mess. What you see is what you get, and it's perfect for families. The recipe has insane value for money, and we as a nation have always stood by convenience food that gives the most bang for your buck. The only thing I'm not really sure about is how the name JoJo got stuck to the dish, but it's pretty catchy. Let's talk about some soul food. It's got a strong place in our culture, and so do potatoes, so naturally, the two have interacted in some pretty delicious ways. A good example of that is the sweet potato pie, which, as you might already expect of most soul food, is a classic from the South, where soul food really thrives thanks to the various African American communities. The pie has a custard-like filling that's made from mashed sweet potatoes. Yeah, you didn't think we'd have a potato dish list without some sweet potato representation, did you? You take that mashed sweet mix and incorporate some sugar, milk, cream, butter, and spices of your choice. But the one rule you need to follow is to stick to warm spices. Things like vanilla, cinnamon, or nutmeg all work really well with this dish. It actually used to be made because of how similar it was to African yams, but it's become a big part of African American culture and is a classic family recipe that's commonly served in Black homes. Whether it's Thanksgiving or Christmas, you can definitely expect sweet potato pie, and I prefer it to pumpkin pies anyway. Pommes de terre soufflé are a much more nuanced dish than the rest. I say nuanced because they require a real sensitive touch and a very attention-to-detail-oriented mindset when you get to work with them. You have to slice the potatoes in a really particular way to start with. You have this really decorative oval shape that looks wonderful, then you need to fry them twice, but you need to be really mindful of the temperature and time. The first fry has to be at a lower temperature, but the second one needs to be cooked with higher heat so that the potatoes can actually puff up. The point of this is to sort of make sure that they're hollow on the inside, and that's most of your work done. Then there's the most crucial part, the right amount of salt. It really can ruin the whole thing, you know? If you do get the hang of it, then you're going to be the person with the most impressive basket whenever you go to your next family picnic. This is a mix that took me a while to get used to, if I'm being totally honest with you. Jalapeno popper potato salad was a name that took me for a spin when I first heard it because, well, jalapenos and potatoes? Experimentative and reasonable. I can see the potential. There's just a lot of room to miss, you know? But luckily, that's one thing this dish just doesn't know how to do. It's made with boiled potatoes, pickled and diced jalapenos, crispy bits of bacon, shredded cheese, Parmesan or cheddar, and your choice of onions. The base is a creamy mayonnaise or sour cream mix, and you end up getting an extremely lovely salad that has smokiness and savoriness and is great for picnics and barbecues. Now, I don't know about you, but that's definitely what I'd call range. This is actually a dish that's pretty popular in Mexican culture, and this dish is considered to be a mix of the two cultures interacting and finding a sweet middle ground we can all enjoy and love. We're not going to stop exploring Mexican culture at just jalapeno potato salads. We're going to get deep into it with gorditas. All of our Mexican viewers, this one's especially for you. So gorditas are these really spectacular Mexican corn cakes that can be best described as a significantly thicker tortilla. And it involves this masa corn dough, stuffed with chorizo, shredded beef, potatoes, cheese, and spices and seasonings. You can either fry it or cook it, but you're doing both on a griddle. And the best part about this is you can eat them wrapped up as they are or split them open to get all that filling oozing outside. If you ever go to Mexico, you'll find streets filled with gordita stalls because they're a big part of Mexican comfort food preferences and have been a go-to for the people there for a long while. And now it's your turn to discover all the wonders of mesa-based dishes mixed with the goodness of potatoes. If we talk about comfort food and what's a popular and reliable option on our side of things, then it would be pretty criminal to not mention potato rolls. They're not just popular in the wider scope of America's foodscape. They're also a big part of Dutch and Amish communities in cities like Pennsylvania and Chicago. These potato rolls melt in your mouth and have a pretty soft crumb, and they go great with sauces and spreads. How many dishes do you know can say that they work with both a spread and a sauce? I thought so. Dip it in peanut butter or barbecue sauce. You're still in for a good time. It was common to have these alongside sandwiches, burgers, and even fried chicken because they just were that good at amplifying dishes like that. When fast food culture really started picking up in America and the McDonald's business model spread like wildfire, that was when potato rolls got a big boost in popularity too. Nowadays, they're not really the first thing that pops up in your head or the first thing your eye goes to at a restaurant, but they're still just as dependable, and they've built up a community of many happy customers over the years. Chili oil smashed potatoes are the last thing we have on our potato parade, and they're a pretty nice note to go out on. Twice cooked potatoes, spicy chili oil, some nice peppercorns, garlic, sesame. What else do you need? Just reading this out loud made my mouth water. Chili oil smashed potatoes actually became popular as a result of a chili oil craze that recently started in America around the 2000s. But this dish is also trying to go subcontinental with some of its flavors. You can clearly tell the East Asian influences here with the Szechuan, garlic, and extra spice. Also, you can't just use any old potato for these. They need to be baby potatoes or fingerling ones. Once you boil them, you smash them flat and make sure they get a nice even roast until you get that perfectly golden, crispy edge on every side. Contemporary American cooking has become a blend of flavors, traditions, habits, and preferences from all over the world now. And this dish is just one example of that. You go back just 50 to 80 years, and what people were doing with potatoes looked so much different than what you see today. Stuff like this just would not have ever made the cut back then. But now, it's actually a pretty trendy choice for millennials and Generation Z as a party meal or something to bring to hangouts. I mean, that's how I had my first try. Potato pancakes, also known as latkes, were an incredibly trendy breakfast option that dominated the tables of most households for a long while. As with many things in the 1900s, this also had its roots in the Great Depression. Back then, as you might have remembered when we were talking about pork and beans, it was pretty hard to afford any kind of protein or most vegetables. What was easy to buy and grow yourself, however, was potatoes. With increased farming capabilities and creative ingenuity, an entire variety of potato-based dishes became widely adopted across the nation. You just need to grate your potatoes and shape them into pancakes, then fry until golden brown. Typically, these would get served with honey or applesauce or even sour cream. Plus, it took two of America's top comfort options and fused them together, so it makes sense that it lasted a long while after the recession itself ended. Steak Diane is a retro classic that brought a touch of restaurant elegance to home kitchens in the 1970s. It is said to have originated in the 1950s. By the 1970s, Steak Diane had made its way into home kitchens, celebrated for its dramatic preparation and luxurious flavors. How? Well, a little bird told me that New York chef Beniamino Schiavone thought it was a bright idea to name this meal after Diana, the goddess of the hunt, to attract high society diners. I guess it worked. Steak Diane was made with steaks, shallots, Dijon mustard, Worcestershire sauce, and heavy cream. If you've never had these, you're missing out on something. And if you did, would you want to try it again? I'd travel back in time for it and maybe grab the chicken merengue on my way back. Cheese fondue took it a few notches further than just spreads and fillings. This was an entire melted pot of cheese that would be served alongside toasted bread or garlic bread to be used as a dipping. Explaining the exact sensation of cheese melted just hot enough on crispy fresh bread sprinkled blending together is hard. Seeing why this became so famous in the early days is not a tough ask at all, on the other hand. Starting out with just bread, even items like burgers and pizzas were among people's top choices. Cheese fondue dominated America's dipping scene for a good while. Presently, the trend for cheese fondue died down considerably, especially as the nation became more health conscious. Having pots of melted cheese were not ideal anymore, despite the irresistible taste that made it so hard to say no. Potato rissoles are yummy patties made from mashed potatoes mixed with a variety of ingredients and then fried until golden and crunchy on the outside. This must have been inspired by rissoles, which are a small croquette or patty made from minced meat or fish, mixed with various ingredients such as onions, herbs, breadcrumbs, and sometimes eggs. Potato rissoles have roots in Europe, where they were a popular way to use up leftover potatoes. By the 1970s, they had become a beloved side dish or even a main course in many American households thanks to their satisfying texture. If you miss that 70s feel and are not afraid to try old recipes, go ahead and make some for yourself. Who else remembers making these with Mom in the kitchen? I miss making those mashed potatoes. Next is this really tasty steak called Steak Diane. Trust me, it has nothing to do with a woman named Diane. Shirred eggs are something we bet you have not heard of before. If you have, then you must have been from the Midwest, Louisiana, or the northern areas of New York. This is because Franco-American communities were most commonplace in those areas, and this is a dish of French origin. It takes your taste buds and brain for a spin, since we bet you are not used to the idea of baked eggs. In the 70s, though, this was all the rage. These were eggs that would be baked in a flat-bottomed dish, and not only were these a trend of the 70s, they had been popular since the Victorian era. Talk about vintage, right? While the word baked might evoke thoughts of a muffin-like texture, it's more accurate to think of an egg custard. These eggs were baked in a bath of cream that made the white and the yolk pretty thick, and we have to say it looks like something worth trying. This stew features tender rabbit meat slow-cooked with vegetables and broth, perfect for chilly evenings. Originating from European peasant cuisine, it used available game meat. Rabbit meat was often preferred for its lean quality and delicate flavor, making it a versatile choice for stews. By the 1970s, it was beloved in American homes for its rich flavor and rustic appeal. In Greece, especially on Crete and Icaria, rabbit stew is a celebrated dish, often made with local game meats. In Slovenia, rabbit meat is recommended for babies starting solids due to minimal antibiotic use and its natural taste. Though rabbits are now often pets, making them less popular as food, for the adventurous, start by browning the rabbit pieces in a pot and adding seasoning. It's perfection on a plate, much like bouillabaisse. Cottage cheese salad being next up after we ended the last segment on America becoming health conscious is ironic, but yes, this was actually a very common diet food. Even if you were not dieting, people would eat it simply for either having a healthy, tasty meal or for the overall benefit. Summer vegetables like cherry tomatoes and green onions were used. Onions and cucumbers made for a very great meal to eat if you felt like turning your life around next week, or if you needed to lose a few inches off your waist before an event. Calorically speaking, this is lower than what you would expect despite using a lot of cottage cheese. All-rounders are appealing, so anyone can figure why this became a staple. However, people turned to things like Russian salads and the like eventually. Stuffed mushrooms were these mushroom caps that had a mixture of several fillings to add variety to your diet for the week and give you a whirlwind of flavors to think about post-meal. We are talking about American favorites like herbs, sausages, breadcrumbs, and of course, natural fresh mushrooms. A variety of cheeses would be used too, from goat's cheese to ricotta depending on how far you were willing to take the dish. Most restaurants stuck to goat's cheese, but if all you had on you was Parmesan, then it would work just fine. As for the mushrooms, portobello mushrooms were non-negotiable as they were the heart and soul of the dish. Then you had your usual stuff like pine nuts, sun-dried tomatoes, and roasted red peppers. It sounds like an incredibly savory dish that would set your taste buds on fire. Welsh rarebit is another step that America took when it comes to comfort cooking because this was just a delectably thick melted cheese sauce on toast. That made it such an addictive snack that it went beyond simply being good and became something people just regularly had every day like coffee and muffins are nowadays. People would get incredibly fancy with this, going as far as applying wine or ale and mustard blended with cheese to create a bechamel sauce. Historically, this has been in cookbooks in America like since the mid-1700s, so it definitely had a fair time in the sun, but nowadays you would not find this as a comfort snack or breakfast food. American cuisine later started incorporating cheese more frequently in meat-based dishes such as meatloaf, burgers, and pizzas, although some may still remember the original uses. If you're new to this meal, a little background. Haddock mornay is a creamy dish that added French sophistication to 1970s dinner tables. This casserole features haddock fillets baked in a cheese sauce made from Gruyere or cheddar, milk, and Dijon mustard. Haddock mornay is prepared by poaching haddock in milk and then creating a cheese sauce with butter, flour, and the reserved poaching liquid. The sauce is poured over the haddock, topped with breadcrumbs, and baked until golden. In the 1970s, haddock mornay was famous as a sophisticated yet approachable dish. They didn't lie. If it's cheese, it has to be good. I have to admit, some of these 70s foods were weird, like frog legs. This savory stew features tender chicken cooked with tomatoes, garlic, onions, and white wine, often garnished with mushrooms and sometimes even prawns. Chicken Marengo was named after the Battle of Marengo, where it is said that Napoleon's chef created this meal from available ingredients after a victorious battle in 1800. Legend has it that Napoleon refused to eat until a meal was prepared, prompting the chef to gather what he could from the battlefield. It became popular in French cuisine and eventually made its way to American kitchens. Back then, chicken Marengo was found in cookbooks and food magazines, presented as an exotic yet accessible dish for home cooks. And then it went away, just like oyster stew. As you can imagine, the more popular players in the scene and their influence will be felt heavily throughout this list, and Surge is one of those examples. Maybe by now you can tell that Pepsi and Coca-Cola had an ongoing rivalry in an attempt to find the next best soda. One they could sell to Americans of all ages, sex, color, ethnicity, and any other descriptor for people. Basically, they wanted the next jackpot and Pepsi hit that with Mountain Dew. Surge was Coca-Cola's counter to the ever-increasing popularity of Dew. Everyone has a Dew phase after all, so we can get what they were thinking. Sadly, Old Coke would never learn because Surge was also just another stronger Mountain Dew. Plus, the rumors about it being unhealthy did not help much at schools and family homes. It got discontinued because it just was not worth the time and cost anymore. This classic seafood soup features plump oysters gently cooked in a rich, milky broth seasoned with butter, onions, and a hint of celery. It has roots in the coastal regions of America, where oysters were plentiful and not so expensive. Historically, oysters were considered food for the poor due to their abundance along the coastlines. People who have roots along the coast or often visited loved ones there appreciate the simple essence of this stew. Made with fresh oysters, milk, salt, pepper, butter, and a touch of green onion, it embodies simplicity at its finest. Oyster stew became especially popular as a festive dish served during the holiday season, particularly on Christmas Eve, in many families of the mid-20th century. Dinner time was epic back then, and I miss it, but not as much as I miss this herring salad. Speaking of caffeinated, how could we ever forget Mellow Yellow? Despite coming earlier, these guys took a completely opposite direction from their competitors and thought, let's not make something that's like coffee and a soda, let's make a caffeinated lemonade. Down on the East Coast, people absolutely loved Mellow Yellows. Maybe the others should have learned from history, because in the East, this did pretty well. Mellow Yellow was the kind of drink that made you think sodas each need their own identity. Tying matters with a sweet lemon bow on top was the fact that it was extremely refreshing on hot summer days. A few cans of this took the heat off, especially if you were in an air conditioner. Drinks rarely last as long as it did, and it recently attempted a national expansion in the early 2000s, but it didn't really pan out. Now it is just an East Side memory. Steamed pudding brought a touch of old-world charm to 1970s family dinners. Made by steaming a batter of flour, eggs, sugar, and sweat or butter, often with dried fruits and spices, it results in a moist, dense pudding. The slow steaming process ensures the flavors meld together beautifully, creating a rich dessert experience. There are many types of steamed puddings, including Christmas pudding, which is served during the holiday season. There's also spotted dick made with dried fruits. Steamed pudding has origins in British cuisine and was cherished in the 1970s for its rich flavor and nostalgic value. Cookbooks highlighted it as a perfect dessert for special occasions, celebrated for its anticipation and warm, spiced goodness. Have you ever had rabbit stew? So the history behind mulligatawny soup actually dates back to our colonial days when America was still under British rule. The story goes something like this. British officers and VIPs would constantly request this soup as their first course, which mostly has Indian origins. Originally, the soup was a pretty thin one, but to suit their taste palates, it was thickened up with vegetables and meat. That was all during the 18th century, and if we skip forward to the 1970s, this was already in cookbooks around the nation. It took on another form entirely different from its roots, and it started to look more like a curry soup with chicken, vegetables, apples, and rice. Those are ingredients that the average American is not familiar with in their soup, but if you are open to trying, you might be very surprised. Do you all remember that popular cartoon Ratatouille? Well, that meal was tasty in real life, not just in the cartoon. Originating from Provence, Ratatouille was celebrated in the 1970s for its healthy, flavorful vegetarian option. One of the earliest French mentions can be found in Henri Ayrault's 1903 book La Cuisine à la Nice, where it is described as a stew of eggplants, tomatoes, peppers, and zucchinis. Elizabeth David, a prominent British cookery writer, later featured a ratatouille recipe in her influential 1950 book, A Book of Mediterranean Food. This vegetable stew added Provençal charm to 1970s dinner tables with its medley of summer vegetables simmered in olive oil with fragrant herbs. Who misses haddock mornay? Bad attempts at improving what already works, Pepsi-Cola was the next surge. Supposedly a coffee-based drink that still worked in the Pepsi flavor you knew and loved, it came around in 1996 when it was first being test-marketed. Boy, was that one train wreck of a test, because initial feedback alone was a definite no from the get-go. People did not react well to the drink much, though some positive reviewers from brave and bold soda enthusiasts were there. Not enough to shake the fiscal reports sadly, because after its official launch, it didn't even last a good year. The reasons for its bad performance in the market was that people knew what they wanted, but apparently companies did not. When people wanted a coffee-based drink, there were many better options to go to. When they just wanted a Pepsi, nothing else could replace it. Safe to say, fixing a very well-functioning clock leads to a pretty steep hole in the bank accounts, huh? This beet soup brought Eastern European tradition to 1970s kitchens with its deep red color and tangy flavor. To prepare borscht, sauté onions, garlic, and carrots in a pot until softened. Add chopped beets, cabbage, and potatoes, cook for a few more minutes, then pour in the broth and bring to a boil. Simmer until vegetables are tender, then add vinegar or lemon juice. Borscht is often enriched with beef or pork for additional depth of flavor, making it a hearty meal. Serve hot with sour cream and fresh dill. Borscht became a dish when Ukrainians, influenced by the Romans, began incorporating beets into the recipe. In the 1970s, due to Eastern European immigrants and a growing interest in international cuisines, it became popular in the US. There was a whole cookbook just for it. That was Jane Blankstein's Nothing Beats Borscht, Jane's Russian Cookbook. North America, on the other hand, dealt with soda shakeups of its own when PepsiCo launched Slice There. A line of fruity drinks that had real juice in them, these were extremely popular drinks for the summer. No surprise, since that is how they were marketed as like everywhere. And yet again, this is Pepsi clapping back from Coke coming up with Sprite. Seriously, is the entire industry just these two at this point? Lemon Lime Slice was the original, and it came to red carpets and trophies from everyone. People adored the mango juice flavor that was actually a bit new for Americans at the time. Tropical cuisine and flavors had not quite made their mark on most folks just yet. Of course, mango juices were popular in stores and still a thing, but there was no top dog. Slice had a pretty respectable place in the market, but eventually it was discontinued recently and replaced by a new drink called Starry. Still, that's a pretty lengthy journey for a soft drink, isn't it? This vibrant and tangy dish added a punch of flavor to 1970s spreads. It features pickled herring mixed with diced apples, onions, beets, and potatoes in a creamy dressing of mayonnaise and sour cream. Herring salad, also called herring under a fur coat or shuba, has roots in Northern and Eastern European cuisine. The addition of vegetables and a creamy dressing makes it both visually appealing and flavorful. It became popular in the US in the 1970s at potlucks and family gatherings. The salad was often featured in cooking magazines as a bold and sophisticated dish for entertaining. No wonder Russians see it as one of the best salads ever. Placed side by side with steamed pudding, I don't know which one I'd choose. Which would you go for? Cheese straws come from pretty humble beginnings when compared to the soufflé because these were just a method of preservation. People in the South went crazy over cheese to the point where they would usually keep a pretty decent stock of it. Heat was going to be a problem though, because it would often melt and people would preserve cheese by making dough with cheese and spices. The vertical thin shape made them really portable, so they made for great comfort food. 30 to 40 was not exactly a surprising amount of cheese straws to have in the fridge. As far as baked treats go, cheese straws were absolutely delicious and made it all the way to White House cookbooks. Surprisingly, it is not a handy meal people make anymore, even though there would be platters full at many dinners. These delicious pancakes are made from a batter mixed with sweet corn kernels, giving them a tender inside and a golden, crispy exterior. Corn fritters have their roots in Native American cuisine and Southern cooking, where corn has always been a staple ingredient. They became popular in the 1970s as a versatile side dish or snack. Corn fritters are made by mixing flour, baking powder, sugar, and salt with whisked eggs and milk to form a batter. Stir in corn kernels, then fry spoonfuls in hot oil until golden and crispy. They can be enjoyed plain or with a drizzle of honey or syrup for added sweetness. It's giving, "Grandma made me these, and I love it just like I love my potato rissoles." Next up is OK Soda, which despite the best efforts of the company to market and promote it as a more citrusy Coca-Cola tasting soft drink, just could not cut it. When this first hit the shelves, yeah, people went to try it and bought cans while they were just hanging around. Slowly, the opinion that started to form as it became something everyone talked about was that, while having more of its own vibe than New Coke, it did not work. Lots of the Gen X crowd were thinking this just felt like an off mix of orange soda and a Coke. People move on from soft drinks much faster than they do from trendy food, so it really gets hard to make one that sticks. Despite its best efforts, this soda did not get the okay and faded away from shelves. Cheese soufflé to start us off fancy and proper because, after all, who does not love having this for lunch? Across different eras of food in the USA, it has taken on form after form. Incorporating different kinds of cheeses like Parmigiano or Reggiano into the dish, it was a popular sight at many restaurants and in homes generally. French Americans in particular adored it, and it was a favorite at fusion restaurants across the 90s. Having retained some of its success but not all, it still is quite present, but more so as a restaurant item. Home-baked soufflés that used common superstore ingredients and unique variations are now a thing of the past. Trends change over time, and for America, cheese soufflé started to not be something you would expect at family tables usually, except maybe on rare occasions. This luxurious dish is made with lots of fish and shellfish simmered in a fragrant broth of tomatoes, garlic, onions, leeks, fennel, and saffron. Bouillabaisse has its roots in the port city of Marseille, where fishermen would make this stew using the bony rockfish they couldn't sell at the market. The dish's name derives from the French words bouillir, to boil, and abaisser, to reduce, reflecting the cooking method. It became famous internationally as a symbol of French cuisine, with its complex flavors made by combining onions, leeks, garlic, and fennel in olive oil until soft and fragrant. If you make this, would you invite me over? Here's the one meal I really want back: borscht. Goulash was something you would see fairly often if you were from the Midwest, but even if you were just visiting for a few days, it was a dish you could not really escape around there. Lots of people would recommend you try street-style goulash or order it when you were visiting a restaurant. Plus, if you had any family or friends living in Midwest areas, you would definitely get served this at one of their homes. The dish itself has the nutritional benefits of pork and beans, but it has a lot more of an explosive taste. We can thank the mix of macaroni, tomato sauce, and ground beef for that. Once you bring those together in a goulash, it creates a symphony of flavors that people just adored back in the day. Pimento cheese specials were a simple spread that was as beloved in Southern America as the others on the list so far. Pimento peppers and shredded cheese were all you needed to have yourself a volatile spread flavor-wise. Citizens of the state easily remember when this got popular enough to start being sold in canned variants. Pimento cheese specials were usually referred to as the South's very own pâté. Flavors just made sense no matter the combination. And before you ask yourself, yes, it was very popular with sandwiches. Toast or flatbreads or lasagna, this went with everything, and it elevated most things it was mixed in. Pimento peppers are a bit of an uncommon ingredient nowadays that do not see much use. However, this was a very warm moment in America's cheese history that might make a comeback. Richard Gay may have been the first one to use the term frogmore stew, but the dish itself was a South Carolina classic. This dish had several variations out way before he would think of a name for the dish in the 1960s. An icon of low country cuisine and something the middle class adored, it was a one-pot meal made of shrimp, corn on the cob, smoked sausage, and sweet potatoes. These were the four basic ingredients, but sometimes you could swap out the sweet potatoes for regular ones. People would also add live blue crab or stone crab claws and onions as well. A combination of ingredients like this is not something you see today anymore, especially literal crab claws. Admit it, though. It does make you curious as to what this tastes like, right? Unfortunately, it has become increasingly difficult to find a place that makes authentic frogmore stew, as the dish has largely faded in popularity. Okay, chicken and waffles is a brunch staple. But here's the thing. This food combo is still a surprise to many people around the globe. When you think of waffles, your mind usually goes to maple syrup and strawberry toppings, but chicken pairs up just as well. You know what they say, opposites attract. It is a Southern classic that combines crispy fried chicken with fluffy waffles and syrup. You know those days when you can't decide whether you want something sweet or savory for breakfast? Well, chicken and waffles is your answer. Now, I know it sounds like a third grader came up with this food combination, but it might surprise you to know that this dish has a long and rich history, originating as a soul food dish in African American communities. You heard that right? Trust me, drizzle some maple syrup over your fried chicken and you won't regret it. Chicken vol au vent is a chicken meal full of surprises. This dish features a flaky, golden puff pastry shell, as light and airy as a cloud. But the real magic lies within. Inside this pastry shell is a creamy chicken ragu, a rich and flavorful stew packed with tender chicken pieces, vegetables, and a sauce. The best part? You could add any veggies according to your liking as long as mushrooms were a staple. Now, This meal was fancy and exquisite, so it wasn't really something you ate at dinner parties. Chicken vol au vent was reserved for Michelin-starred restaurants back in the day. It's a rare find in the States now, but if you're ever craving this bad boy, book a flight to Belgium because it's still a common main course there. The Belgian version of this pastry is filled with a combination of chicken, mushrooms, and small meatballs served with either mashed potatoes or fries. Fun fact: fricassee is not a name in itself. Instead, it is a cooking method that involves braising meat in a creamy sauce. The sauce typically includes cream or a mixture of broth and cream, thickened with flour or egg yolks. This stew is made with tender rabbit pieces simmered in a creamy white sauce with mushrooms, onions, and herbs. Rabbit fricassee has roots in French cuisine and became beloved in 1970s America for its rich taste and tender meat. It was featured in gourmet cookbooks like Mrs. Benjamin Chew Howard's 50 Years in a Maryland Kitchen. This popular classic Maryland cookbook was printed and reprinted over the years, with a revised edition coming out sometime in the 1940s, which was reprinted in the 80s. The rabbit was a popular choice among monks during Lent because it was classified as a type of fish, permitting its consumption. Rabbit meat, known for its all-white texture, looks like chicken, but with a consistency similar to pork. Brunswick stew was a tomato-based dish that included locally sourced beans, vegetables, and small game, such as squirrels or rabbits. Today, it typically includes larger cuts of protein, such as beef or pulled pork, but the original 1970s version was much simpler. Despite the lack of larger proteins, the stew still had a vibrant flavor that was unmistakable. The lima beans, corn, and tomatoes were the perfect combo to bring the slightly more hidden notes of the dish to life. Plus, it was really cheap to make, and it did not take a lot of time either, which for stews is pretty amazing. Most stews take up either your entire day or half your wallet if you are trying to have one with some actual personality. This was oozing with character, though, and a lot more. What we cannot figure out is why such a reliable option faded into history along the way. Similar to chicken croquettes, chicken rissoles were another way of using up that leftover chicken in the fridge. However, instead of a breadcrumb coating, rissoles take a more fancier approach. We're talking rich, buttery pastry dough with a mixture of minced chicken, vegetables, and herbs. These were a fan-favorite finger food and a hit at parties and gatherings. They originated in France in the early to mid-20th century and dominated European countries, with different countries coming up with their own unique versions. Here's the thing, though. Chicken rissoles aren't the easiest to make, so if you ever want to give them a try, call your grandma. A nostalgic bonding experience over cooking rissoles? Count me in. Chicken pudding may sound strange, but it was pretty much a steamed chicken casserole. Now it made it to our list, so there's got to be more to it, right? It wasn't your typical chicken casserole. This dish involved mixing cooked chicken with breadcrumbs, eggs, and seasonings, then steaming the mixture until set. The result was a savory, pudding-like consistency that was both comforting and filling. Chicken pudding was particularly popular in the early to mid-20th century, especially in rural areas where it was a hearty and economical meal. Despite its name, it wasn't a dessert, but a savory main course, often paired up with gravy or a side of vegetables. It wasn't the healthiest dinner option out there, but its taste truly spoke for itself. Today, chicken pudding is nothing more than a rare sight, gone but never forgotten. Now, onto some more unusual 70s food. Let's bring back roast goose. Roast goose is a magnificent and festive dish that graced many holiday tables in the 1970s. This succulent bird features crispy skin and tender, flavorful meat, often accompanied by rich gravy and traditional sides. It has a long history in European cuisine, especially in Germany and Britain, as a traditional Christmas dish. Economically, using geese as a main dish and selling them as food was a smart decision. They were larger than chickens, so a whole family could feed on one of them, so long before turkey took over, there was a goose. Okay, how about rabbit fricassee? Pot roasts are not exclusively enjoyed by the middle class, as people from presidents to everyday citizens have fond memories of this dish. However, pot roasts became a common Thanksgiving tradition across the nation. Not just Thanksgiving, it was pretty common as a weekend meal or a Christmas one too. Point being, the holidays were never complete without a good pot roast. If you've never had one, pot roasts are essentially slow-cooked beef roasts served with a thick, creamy gravy. It's surprising given that they remain fairly popular today. Vegetables like onions, tomatoes, and peppers would also be there, though each family had its own variation on what they would put in. Either way, you have to try pot roasts at least once in your life if you never have. That wraps up our list of forgotten potato recipes that are just too good to miss. Have you made any of the recipes we talked about? Comment down below and don't forget to like and subscribe.